Well, welcome to the Practice Makes Faithful podcast. We are excited to be jumping into a brand new series today. We're in our 5th episode, still kind of a brand new thing, as always. So I'm Ben Patterson. I'm joined here with Paul Hugobart. But this month, we have a special guest. We are joined by Rob Shaver.
Hello.
What's up, Rob?
How's it going?
Yeah. All right. Hey, we're excited about this.
No doubt. Good to have Rob with us.
Yes.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. We're glad. We're glad this is something that you enjoy being a part of. We're not like holding you against your will here. Yeah.
Yeah. As soon as I found out that you guys were going to start this, I've been trying to angle my way on. So.
And
there are others too.
Apparently I'm not alone. Not alone in that effort.
That's right.
The way to get on the podcast is preaching. We've learned, and you started a new series at Grace Chapel.
Yeah.
So you made it.
Yes. There may be other ways, but they have not been discovered yet.
Okay.
That's right.
So Rob, tell us, what is your favorite podcast? Are you a podcast man?
I have on my phone now Google Podcasts, and I'm currently subscribed to just one podcast. It is my favorite.
Oh.
It is called
Suspense.
Practice Makes Faithful.
Oh, I heard about this. I heard it was good.
It is a gem.
It's good. We made the Rob list.
Right.
That's amazing.
That's excellent.
Amazing.
That's excellent. I mean, we kind of had set that as something we aspired to, if we could get Rob listening to the podcast. Yeah. That's actually one of the reasons why we thought to bring you on the podcast, is then maybe you'd listen to it, but you're already listening to it. Mm-hmm. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
On Tuesday mornings.
I know you read a lot of books, Rob.
On my drive down.
It's an honor to be included on that list.
Yeah.
That's good.
I mean, I've only heard the first 20 minutes of any of the podcasts. But it's good. You guys got a good start.
Yeah, always the first 20 minutes that's where we really excel. After that, you're fine, just tune out.
Then I get to the church building and turn it off.
There you go. Yeah, the drive's only 20 minutes. There's a drive home.
Oh.
You listen to the backside. It picks up right where you left off typically.
I hadn't thought of that yet.
That's a gem for all of you who are either watching or listening right now, is to know that if you have a 20-minute ride on the way into work, you can just pick up right where you left off on the way back home and finish the podcast.
That's a
little known fact, but it is a stroke of brilliance. I agree.
Got some catching up.
Awesome. Yes. There you go. All right, so Rob, tell us a little bit about yourself for anyone who's never met you before. Maybe they've tuned into the podcast, but they don't know Rob. Tell us a little bit about who is Rob.
Ooh, well, just let's see. We're in February. Next month, I'm going to turn 40. So that's a little bit about my age and who I am, because you can make all the assumptions you want about a 40-year-old white man, and I guess I probably meet some of those. But yeah, I've got a wife, 4 kids, a couple dogs. Been in ministry for a while. I kind of uniquely worked with a church in Utica, New York, for 17 years. So just to have that kind of longevity in one place is not seen as much these days. But it was a really good run, and just a lot of great relationships. And man, if you've not heard yet the story about how I went from there and ended up here, then you should, if you're a part of Grace Chapel or live in the area around Cumming, Georgia, stop me and ask me. It's an incredible thing. Just gives us all the confidence in the world that God brought us here.
Yeah,
and
agreed.
That's awesome. We know it's been an awesome fit here as the discipleship minister. We just loved having you. It's been amazing. But tell us a little bit, what does a discipleship minister do?
Yeah, it's, as I was leaning into the role a little bit more, just trying to find that out for myself. What does a discipleship? But I think discipleship, people generally look at that term in 2 different ways. Either discipleship as kind of a post-conversion process. Okay, you're a Christian now. Discipleship is how you get closer to Jesus in the process of getting closer to Jesus. But then when you look at the Great Commission and Jesus saying, go out and make disciples, then some groups or churches will look at discipleship as more on the front end, before you're converted.
Right.
What do we need to do to get you to know Jesus and trust him enough to give your life to him?
Sometimes call evangelism.
Right, yeah, more on the evangelistic side. So then But it seemed like as I got here, and I kind of had a preconceived idea of what I'd be doing, but as I really felt things out, got to talk to church leaders, church members, that both of those things were embraced, and that's, I think, maybe a good, healthy way to look at discipleship is the entire process, right? Yeah. So no matter where you are, you can be learning more about Jesus and learning more about what it means to follow Jesus. And so I'm trying to figure out what that means within my role, to kind of envelop that whole thing. More specifically, I guess, that it's not for here and for us, not developing a separate discipleship program, but more so just seeing how, because that's the whole thing, how does that fit into everything we do? So it's been a joy so far, because most everybody's been really accepting of that, actually excited that it's not another program.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so I get to work with everybody, and it's been great. It's been a really good start so far.
I love that. That's one of the goals here for this podcast. Our title, Practice Makes Faithful. It's about practicing the way of following Jesus.
Absolutely.
We do hope to help on your discipleship journey. So it's a great fit to have you here.
Yep.
And you're here as we begin talking about this series that you kicked off. For us, it was yesterday at Grace Chapel, but whenever you're listening to that, it's this past Sunday in February, and new series called Back on Track. Right. So can you tell us a little bit about this series? Why did you choose this? Kind of give us an idea of what's the goal of this series? Where are you hoping to go with this?
Yeah. I have one of those stories. Sometimes people will preach a sermon, right, and they'll get up and they'll say, "Let me tell you about how this sermon came to be." And that's one of my pet peeves. But I'm going to tell you about how this. Yeah. So I didn't do it on Sunday though. But I think, I don't know when it was, in November, and Paul who puts the preaching schedule together, approached me and said, "Rob, how about February?" And it makes sense that if you were going to preach, since you're the discipleship minister, something to do with discipleship. And so I did spend some time in prayer, and when you get an answer, right? So I was praying about, Lord, what do you want me to preach on? Where do you want me to preach from? I really did feel committed to just, instead of jump around to different texts, just try to stay in one book of the Bible. And I had a couple of ideas of where that might be. Things that I'd taught in the past, or things that I'd learned in the past, that I was excited about different directions. And I felt like God told me, as much as we can get that nudge,
right. Yeah.
1 Corinthians. And I rebelled against that. I was like, 1 Corinthians, what does that have to do with discipleship, and disciple making, and not what I wanted to preach. But I decided I would try to obey God, and just kind of diving into the text and going through it, just seeing this church that's just in turmoil and really messed up, and the correction, and really saying this is a huge aspect of this letter, is just correction. All right, but then this it just jumped out at me, chapter 11 and verse 1, where Paul says, "Will follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." But that wasn't it. That verse I'd read so often out of context. So I go back just a couple of verses, and he's talking about putting others first and doing all of this for the glory of God, and doing it all so that some people might be saved.
Right.
And then it's there where he says, "So I want you to follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." And so it just kind of blew my mind. It's like, wait, this whole book is about making disciples, right? And this is the root of their problem. Even though he addresses all the specifics, the root was really that they were a church that had gone away from what they were intended to do, make disciples and glorify God. Because of that, they got caught up in all of these ridiculous things. And so that's the hope, and the goal is, hey, we can see ourselves in them. Maybe we judge ourselves to be better than the Corinthians. That's usually what we do. But hey, anytime we get off track, we can kind of come back to true north, right? And what is our focal point? Should be glorifying God and making disciples. And so wow. I mean, God just kind of knocked me over and said, "Here you go." But that's where it came from, and that's the goal.
That's really good. I think the Corinthian letter in particular is a really interesting one. I think often we're tempted to look at the world around us and kind of feel like, boy, things are really bad now. But it is kind of wild as we look through Scripture we see all these examples of times where things were difficult, where certainly I think immorality was, was front and center in a lot of ways. And we see that it was, definitely in the Corinthian church. In fact, on Sunday you talked about the Corinthian church, and you said they were caught up in 4 specific things. And I think the Apostle Paul there is basically saying the Israelites were caught up in this stuff, you're caught up in this stuff as well. So the Israelites, maybe roughly 1,500 years before the Corinthian church, were caught up in some of the same struggles than the Corinthian church was, and maybe to some degree we are today as well. So I guess, the question I have is, do you see the church even today struggling with these 4 things? So I'll list the 4 things real quick. It's idolatry, sexual immorality, testing God, and grumbling against leaders. And if it's not those things, which I think probably it is to some degree, are there other things maybe that are keeping us off track in relation to walking faithfully with God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a lot of those things we can see if it's not the exact same way that it comes about, maybe a very similar thing.
Mm-hmm.
So idolatry is a hard thing for us to really grasp because we don't carve little statues. In the U.S. today, most people aren't doing that and bowing down to some household god. But we do have things. If you look at that, is those people were transferring their hope, and they were taking that and they were putting it into this other item, and we do that with a number of things. We do that with our money. We do that with our jobs. We do that, and so there's those things. But also, like in 1 Corinthians 8, like the first couple of verses, that's where Paul says, he says it's love. Knowledge puffs up. Right. But love builds up, and that's in an argument about idol worship and idolatry things, and so I think that can happen where maybe doctrine is a separate thing. But even the issue they had, and then how they were going about dealing with the issue. So like everybody's got knowledge on it, but what the church really needs is love, because that's what builds us up. And you can definitely see that in the world today. You look around, but inside of churches or between churches, just fights over who's got all the knowledge. Well, we've got better knowledge, or we've got more knowledge than you. And man, through the years, I think that you guys have probably both seen it. I know I've seen it, where people will use doctrine and superior knowledge not to build up the church, but to tear other people down. It's such a sad thing. They were dealing with politics, in the leadership grumblings. That can happen obviously inside a church, and we see it. We see the politics of our world creep into the church, right? So whether it just be Republican, Democrat, and people get so caught up in their particular sides and their camps, then that causes friction. Then when you come in to try to worship Jesus together, it's like, well, I don't know if I can really trust you, or because you believe this or think that. And that can go into other issues too. Should you get vaccinated or not? Should you wear a mask or not? And so there's these peripheral things that really, I guess, highlight the underlying issue that they had. Is that they were immature, they were worldly. Or on Sunday we used this term, Immaworlfish. I think that was it. To kind of selfish, immature, worldly, and selfish, and just kind of when you put yourself first and you're kind of going about things like that, it's just always going to cause huge issues in any kind of like one-on-one relationships. And then when you get a big group together, if everybody's just looking out for themselves, and that happens later in the text too, about the Lord's Supper. Like, and when you come together, you're not even waiting for each other.
Right.
It's just so a lot of that.
You asked a question yesterday, and it really got me to thinking a little bit. I think you asked it somewhere along these lines. Can you imagine what it would look like if a church was full of immature, worldly, and selfish people like the Corinthian church was? What would happen in a church like that? And of course, as you said, we all have our stories, I think, to some degree, and sometimes we've even been involved in those stories in ways that we wish we could go back and maybe have a do-over on, where maybe we acted in an immature way or a worldly way or a selfish way in relation to people within the church. So the times I've been involved in that, maybe as one of the players or instigators, and I look back, especially in my younger days, or even when I've witnessed it happening, certainly, as you say, we're not above the Corinthian church in the sense that we all struggle, I think, with immaturity and worldliness and selfishness at times. And so those things that are part of our flesh, are almost our inherent makeup, they do find their way into the church. And they find our way into our families. I think the more comfortable you get around a group of people, the more of your true identity, unless you wear the I'm a good boy mask, And so I think, definitely what they were struggling with, it was very much out in the open. But yeah, we struggle with the same things today. I mean, we both engage in counseling relationships. I'm sure you could, neither of us are going to tell stories about it because that's, a breach of confidentiality, but we know of instances where people were struggling with, maybe gross, sexual immorality, or, can definitely think about times when people were grumbling against leaders. I can think of times when I grumbled against leaders, and all these things that can be really, truly divisive really do make us, in a sense, back to your word, Immaworlfish. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Immaworlfish. So
as
immature,
right as you can get.
Worldly and selfish. Yeah. So new word of the day, Immaworlfish. It will be Merriam-Webster will have a definition by the end of the day, most likely.
We'll work on that.
Immaworlfish. No, I think that's good, Rob.
Yeah.
Yeah, the counseling thing is true. Like it's sometimes that just boggles my mind. It's like I'm sitting down with a couple that they're in their 60s or 70s and they've been married for 40 years, and I feel like I'm talking to two 4-year-olds, and it's just like, but that so we don't just like grow out of it, and we'll deal with it. Mm-hmm. Our flesh is always going to be tugging at it. That piece of self is always going to say like, no, pay attention to me. Feed me, give me what I want. That's tough. That's what I think good leadership is so important, and where the Corinthians lacked maybe, and even knowing where they should go for help. So some people were definitely wanting to go to the Apostle Paul, who helped start this church, and say, "Hey, man, things are falling down here. Like we need your help." But there's a couple times in the letter that he has to defend his apostleship.
Right.
So kind of knowing that there's some people in the church that are just going to be like, "No, we don't." Like we don't need to listen to that guy. He's not even here anymore. Like he doesn't know our, and they needed that now. So if local churches have good, solid leaders, that I think that can make a huge difference. They can sort. They can see these things at their root, and try to root them out before they turn into something worse.
Yeah, I mean that's a great transition to ask. Like, what is the solution to this Immaworlfish problem that we have in the church? And I mean, you mentioned good leadership. You talked about in the message about teaching, rebuking, correcting, training. So how did the Apostle Paul do this with the Corinthian church? How did they get back on track? How can this be an example for us today?
Yeah, that brought something to mind. A while ago, I kind of saw a difference, because when you first asked the question, I thought accountability. But we came across this difference between accountability and editability, which is a hard word for me to say. But the difference.
I don't even know what that word is.
Right. I had just heard it for the first time about 5 years ago. And the idea with accountability is accountability really has to be desired, right? So if I'm struggling with something, then I can say, here's my goal, Ben. Here's my goal. Here's what I want to try to, or here's what I don't want to do. And so can you hold me accountable to these things, right? Like, and so it's a very permission based thing, where editability is more of a wide open thing. So that'd be like saying, Paul, if you see any place in my life that needs to be edited, right, that needs to be fixed, I give you permission to speak into my life in that larger way. And the problem we have sometimes in the church is people. Like, if I just decide that I want to keep one of you guys accountable, like, that's not really what accountability is, unless you ask for it.
So it's like on a Google Drive document. Some of us use Google Drive, but I think it's a good way to see that is like you can share permissions on a document, where you can share it to be where someone can maybe view the document. That's one level of permissions you can give, and then I can look at what you're writing and I can see like that maybe is accountability, that you're sharing it so that now I see everything that you've written in here. But then you can go to that next level of you can make it shareable so that the other person can edit that document. And is that kind of what you're getting to of
I think
editability? It's even a larger level of voice.
I think that's a great analogy, because even in Google, you can also make somebody just a commenter.
So
they can make the comment, but they don't have the power to change it.
That's
right.
And so I would say we all need those relationships on some of those levels, or else when I'm just left to my own devices, that's a tough struggle, between me and my flesh. So to let people in, to let people edit, to let people hold me accountable, and that's gonna.
That's one thing on a Google Drive doc where they can edit and they can change it, but in your life, a person can't change what you're doing. So what would that look like to have someone who's, editability? Like what does that actually look like? Because they're not actually changing my actions, but what are they doing?
But it could be. Obviously they can't change what you decide, but just to have somebody that's speaking truth, and truth can make a huge difference. Because that's what a lot of. I originally this first sermon was going to have a lot of focus on repentance, and I think that's obviously a good start. But I was thinking about King David, and when he has his error with Bathsheba, and just how amazing it is. It's like, here's a guy, he's king, a man after God's own heart. He's got this great relationship with God, and at this point, he's been living this good life for a little while, and yet when he sins with Bathsheba, he seems to have no idea. Like, he seems to have no idea of what's going on in his own life. And even when the prophet comes to him and shares to him a parallel story, he's still oblivious, right? He's like, that dude that took that other guy's lamb, and something terrible needs to happen to him. And it's like, well, that's you. Like, you are the man. And then he's like, it takes all of that to be struck. And so that's where it is. When it comes to sin in our own lives, sometimes we just know, right? But sometimes we avoid, sometimes we deny, sometimes we are just oblivious, right? Like, we're doing something because we have the rationale, we make excuses for ourselves, and sometimes things that are bad, we even convince ourselves that maybe it's not bad, maybe it's even okay that I'm doing this, maybe it's even profitable. And so to have people in our lives, they can't change what we're doing, but sometimes that is a huge start, is just to say, that's actually not good. That's not right. You can't be doing that.
So I think you kind of, you get the sense, at least in the New Testament at times, that the Apostle Paul and some of the other New Testament writers that do write to kind of correct, rebuke, teach, train, that kind of thing, that they kind of had a sense anyway that the moment you decide to give your life to Jesus and are connected with maybe a local church, especially the leaders of that local church, you're actually moving to that place where you're giving permission to those leaders to be engaged that way. And certainly I think in our society, in our culture, because we talked about this last month, we are so radically individualistic in a sense. So, so I'm a radical individualist, you're a radical individualist, we all are. So when we come and we're part of the body of Christ, because I think we're conditioned to think that my stuff is my stuff, this is my private area, my house is my private property, so my life is my private spot, in a sense, my private place. And so you don't have a right to speak into what is my business, in a sense. So we even use that in the United States. We use that line often, mind your own business. I can think of, as a kid saying that to other kids and having other kids say that to me pretty frequently. It's just a thing. Why don't you mind your own business? But the reality is, at least certainly in reading the way that the Apostle Paul engaged with the Corinthian church, and again others, the Galatian church, it seems like he believed the moment that these folks, these other disciples, gave their life to Jesus, he had now the right and the calling and the invitation to speak into their lives in places where they were maybe off track. So I don't know if that hits you in a certain way. I know you did yesterday talk about, this idea of maybe you could speak to us a little bit more about that, and kind of in principle, this idea of being off track or being kind of in a neutral place versus actually truly heading in the right direction. But I do think that has a lot to do with it, because maybe what is needed is some teaching and rebuking at times, and some correcting and training. But we also have to be willing to receive that teaching and rebuking and that correcting and training, all of that together.
Yeah. Just when you were saying that, at the end of chapter 5, Paul writes very explicitly, he says, it isn't my responsibility to judge outsiders,
Right.
But it certainly is your responsibility to judge those inside the church who are sinning. So yeah, I would say you definitely had that assumption that if you attach yourself to the body of Christ, then you become accountable to people, right? And because they're a part of the body too, and what you do is going to affect them. If it's a negative thing, it's going to affect them negatively, and so that's a huge thing. Yeah, it's 2 Timothy 3:16 that talks about the Word of God is useful for teaching and rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, and I think it was just one of those things, as I kind of diagrammed some of this out, because it felt like what Paul did initially in chapter 10 was do some rebuking, like you're very close to this idolatry stuff, you need to get away, flee from it, and some teaching about it, going back and highlighting the Israelites and what they did and the warning. And then the shift to the end of the chapter where he talks about like following me as I follow Christ seemed a little bit more like the training in righteousness, right?
Yeah.
So like the correcting is...
That's good.
And so we can get to that spot, right? It's like, all right, well, you brought me from off track into this kind of neutral zone, but if I don't know what to do or the next positive steps to take, I'm probably just going to drift back into being off track, And so that's having that bigger approach. And even like, you hear about that, somebody smoking cigarettes and they give up smoking cigarettes, they have a need to fill that void with them. So they might start drinking coffee or chewing gum. And so those things would be seen as more positive things to do. But if they don't, they could go actually the opposite way and start smoking weed, or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, very important to fill our lives up with the good things, and that's the correcting and the training in righteousness.
Yeah, let's talk about that part of it a little bit, because I think we've talked a lot about the side of kind of stopping, like moving away from sin, from the Immaworlfish mindset, and there's this idea from theologian teacher Dallas Willard that I thought was helpful, that kind of came to my mind as you were talking about this, and he talks about this idea of like the gospel of sin management, and it's this terminology he uses to talk about this kind of version of the Christian experience, I'd say, that's just about not sinning, where it's just about, I need to stop doing this and kind of move from this off-track spot, to use your terminology, to this neutral ground. But that's not all that discipleship is. Discipleship is a lot bigger. It's about getting back to the right track. Paul used this imagery, and maybe to steal, I might be stealing your thunder a little bit, but
go
this
for it.
marriage imagery, where if you were to define your marriage relationship as just that I haven't committed adultery, I haven't been cheating on them, that's not a healthy marriage. Like, just to say that, oh man, my marriage is good because I haven't had an affair.
Yeah,
I can feed into that and just say, I've got a couple of mentors that will check in with me from time to time, and that's one of the questions that they ask them. Is, well, how are you and Lori doing? And if that was my answer to them was, well, I'm not having an affair, and I just left it at that, they would wonder, what kind of an answer is that?
Yeah.
So, but sometimes it does seem that we set neutral as almost the pinnacle, right? So whatever was the negative, so I was off track, that was the negative. So I'm going to give up those negative things, and by giving up those negative things, my pursuit of Jesus is going to be raised to this level of neutrality. But Paul is obviously calling the Corinthians and us to something much higher, which is, you were calling it right direction or being back on track. So, how would you maybe characterize that a little bit further? And again, as Ben said, the struggle between living that life of just embracing the gospel of sin management, but maybe embracing this gospel call to really being disciples of Jesus who make disciples.
The other thing that Ben said that I liked a lot was, I think you said that's not discipleship, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, so even earlier I said definitions of discipleship can kind of hinge on where we see conversion, either before or after conversion. But when you look at it as the whole scope of things, what happens is, and what we're trying to really look at is, it's not about, because conversion can often come down to transaction, right? It feels like, all right, I'm going to give my life away, and God's going to give me new life. And sometimes a lot even less mature sounding than that. And so we move from transactional to transformational, right? And then from transactional to relational. And so I think those things can make a huge difference, because when you see things as just, I'm trying not to sin, I don't want to sin anymore, then really that's a product of a list that you have of like, here's the boxes I need to check in order to be a good Christian, and if I don't check them all, then I'm a bad Christian, or what do I need to do to go to heaven or hell? And then that becomes a lot more about me and what I'm doing, and a lot less about God and what He is doing, because there's a whole lot of grace that's involved, right? So it's kind of...
Yeah, I know I've heard that so many times in having conversations with folks where it is very easy to they measure the relationship with Jesus of how well I'm doing by how much I'm sinning. And it's easy to fall in that box when you're looking at your relationship with God. But when you think of it from that marriage terminology, no one would ever do that. No one would ever find that to be acceptable, to measure how good is my relationship with my significant other by how much am I cheating or not.
Right.
And so I just think that's really helpful.
Yeah. So, Rob, as we take this one step further, for individuals or someone who's listening, watching, what would you challenge us to be working on this week? We often like to leave our folks with one thing. It's one thing that we could do that will help us as we try to become more faithful in the way that we follow Jesus. Again, so as the name of our podcast suggests, practice makes faithful. We're looking for weekly, just a thing that we could do, or maybe even a few, that we could practice this week that would help us follow Jesus more faithful. So would you have a one thing for us?
I probably would go along the lines of taking all of this in and considering it, and have a time in your life this week of introspection, and evaluation, to kind of see, because for some people it might be glaring. It might be, this is an area where I'm definitely Immaworlfish. I'm definitely just like focused on myself. I'm hurting other people. I'm hurting my church because I'm just putting myself first in these ways. But for some, that might not be glaring, and so it's more about maybe figuring out the neutral spaces. What are those areas in my life where I'm just kind of drifting, just kind of floating along, and I'm not doing bad, but it's not glorifying God. And those would be the two hallmarks that we saw in chapter 10 and 11:1 of 1 Corinthians, where here's kind of the standard that we want to be going for. There's the right tracks. Does it glorify God? Is it helping other people get closer to Jesus? And so we were just talking about marriage. I could think about my marriage, right? If maybe your marriage is in a neutral zone. You're not fighting. You're not, making the neighbors have to call the police on you, and you're not having that affair. So okay, it's not there, but maybe it's just kind of in that middle zone. Then you can think, well, are there ways that I could use my marriage, or within my marriage, we could do things that actually glorify God and bring other people closer to Jesus? What would those things be? So so it's not like get rid of this or get rid of that, or you have to add all these things into your life. As kind of the baby step ways, what are some things that maybe hit in this neutral zone that we could turn the needle up to being positive, or shift now to be on the right track to glorify God? And
give me an example of what that could look like, of taking something from the neutral zone to being on the right track.
All right. Well, in my own life, years ago, I was going on Tuesday nights and I was playing volleyball, and I would say that was even maybe in the realm of being selfish. There's a time, at some points, Cassie would watch the kids. I would get to go out on my own and do something athletic and sporty, and so I really liked that. But I had a mindset for a good portion of that, like, this is me time, right? Like, this is, like, I'm not going to talk to people, or I'm just going to keep conversations, like, very light and surface level. I'm not going to dig deeper. And then some things happen in our lives. We were kind of adjusting some of our focus to be more disciple-making minded. And so that where that was probably had turned to neutral, I thought, well, here's an opportunity. I'm going every Tuesday, and I'm hanging out with 20, 25 people who aren't Christians. And so then I'd sit in the parking lot before I would go in, and I'd just pray, Lord, give me an opportunity, open up a door, help me to have a conversation. And, got to talk to one guy that lived in the neighboring town, and his family was doing worship in their house because they had just been turned off by a lot of local churches. Got to, really speak into his life a little bit. And then the biggest thing was a woman who I never would have thought, our relationship up to that point, I had prejudged her in certain ways. Well, conversing with her, she just starts opening up about her life, and she ended up coming to the Bible study at our house. We still have connections with her and her family. And so that, I took my volleyball night, and it was neutral or off track, and said, okay, God, I'm going to give this to you. And man, it was so much more fulfilling. That's really good. Going to play volleyball on Tuesday night in that thread, in that vein, saying, okay, I can use this to glorify God. And God, what does God want us to do with that then? He wants us to try to get people closer to Jesus.
That's really good. I think we can all think of some things in our life that are neutral. They're not things that are inherently good or evil, but what would it look like to take that up a level, to put that on track? That can be a part of we can integrate that into our Christian experience. It doesn't have to be this little box over here that's just for this me time, as you put it. But no, it can be a part of our Christian walk.
Right.
I really like that.
Yeah, before we move on, let me try to sum that up so that we get it well. So take stock, look and see if there are any areas of life, or maybe one specific area of life, and for you it was maybe going to your own sporting event. For others it could be going to kids' sporting events. So taking basically what happens to be something that is stuck in the neutral zone and actually taking it to where it's back on track. So what's neutral becomes an opportunity for being unselfish, for glorifying God and loving others, in a sense.
Yeah, and the training and the correcting, I guess if we might have ideas, but that I would say maybe find somebody who you feel like is doing it, and then maybe they can train you and correct you in that. And say, okay, how can I use this kids' play date, or this, I'm walking my dogs. How can I use walking my dogs to glorify God? Well, there's people that can kind of help you get on the right track. And that's why another reason why we have the body.
Yep. So like the Apostle Paul was able to say in 1 Corinthians 11:1, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So for some of us, we actually need to turn around and identify someone who obviously seems to be following the example of Jesus and say, could you teach me how to follow Jesus the way you're following Jesus, which is discipleship.
Right.
It's a big part of that. So yeah, that's excellent.
It's really good. Awesome. Well, as we come to a close, do you have any final thoughts, or maybe even just anything you would just kind of tease maybe where we're going on this series?
Sure. Yeah, I'm really excited because I feel like the first several chapters of Corinthians, then you almost get a sense that the Corinthians were having some effort to make disciples, but because of their immaturity, those things were way off. And so we're going to look at three main areas of their effort that were falling short, and where we actually, I think, often fall short in our efforts to make disciples. So that's where we're going. Tune in next week.
That's good.
There you go.
That's good. It's a great plug. Yeah, so we would love that. If y'all keep following along, you can look at our main channel, our Grace Chapel Church channel, to watch these messages. Go back, check out Rob's message, check out this series as we go forward, and then we'd invite you to keep tuning in here to Practice Makes Faithful as we continue these conversations moving forward. And if you're enjoying this podcast, we say this consistently, but we would just love to hear your feedback. We've actually set up a email address that's just practicemakesfaithful@gmail.com. And I think we'll put a link to that in the podcast, but in the show notes. So if you have any questions for us, anything you'd love to hear us talk about a little bit more, maybe as you're following along with this series, we'd love it. If you've got like a question for Rob that you'd love us to discuss here, drop us an email about that. We'd love to consider that and
absolutely
looking to dive into that here. But thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next week as we continue getting back on track.